House or the Central Theater for Performing Arts in Dover Foxcroft. They are the heart and soul of our smaller communities. But I was disappointed to see that the final bill has stripped provisions from our bipartisan bicameral group that we included in our package to try to keep the focus of these grants on these smaller entities. Specifically, our proposal would have limited the grant amounts that related entities could receive to no more than $10 million and excluded museums with endowments larger than $75 million. Common sense safeguards. Now, I do appreciate that the legislation sets aside $2 billion for entities with 50 employees or fewer. But I'm concerned that as drafted, many venues and museums with significant endowments and other resources could be the largest beneficiaries of this section because of the safeguards that were stripped out by the negotiators. For example, a museum in New York City, say, with $1 billion endowment could receive an outright grant as long as the museum has an auditorium and meets the other eligibility requirements. Mr. President, that surely does not seem like an appropriate use of taxpayer dollars to me, and was clearly designed to help large city venues that will survive without our help. Nevertheless, Mr. President, I am pleased to support this package. This COVID relief is vitally needed for our struggling families, for our hard-hit small businesses, for our challenged schools, for our stressed healthcare system, to promote the distribution of the vaccine and more testing, and to help our overwhelmed Postal Service. I urge support for the package, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader.
I ask consent to complete my remarks before the vote.
Without objection.
With the Senate poised to complete some major business for the country and wrap up a most unusual year, I want to express some gratitude to the men and women behind the scenes who make our work possible. Passing an historic rescue package and a full-year funding bill would be a serious undertaking, even in ordinary circumstances. And of course, this pandemic year has brought anything but ordinary circumstances to the Senate, just like everywhere else. For about 10 months and counting, COVID-19 has imposed new challenges on hundreds of people who are already plenty busy enough. After much of the Senate worked remotely in April, we came back to work in early May, like the essential institution that we are. Month after month, we've taken smart and careful precautions and remained an exemplary safe workplace. And all along, we've not just continued to govern, but completed landmark confirmations and historic legislation for the American people. None of this would have been possible without many people beyond the 100 of us with our names on these desks. I want to thank the Office of the Secretary of the Senate, led by Julie Adams and Mary Sue Jones. This team encompasses everyone from the talented professionals who sit on the dais to the official reporters of debates, to dispersing, and many other offices. Thanks to our parliamentarian, Elizabeth McDonough, who faithfully calls the balls and strikes. She won the admiration of our temporary presider, Chief Justice Roberts, before we reclaimed her as the Senate's own. Thanks also to the Senate Sergeant at Arms, Mike Stenger, and Jennifer Hemingway, and their whole team, from the doorkeepers to the IT team that stood up enormous telework capabilities almost overnight, to the workers who clean offices, move furniture, and keep this place running. Of course, very special thanks are due to our attending physician, Dr. Brian Monahan, and the entire team that he leads. Believe me, they already had a full-time job caring for the members of Congress and the Supreme Court. We've leaned on Dr. Monahan in countless ways all year long. His expertise and wise counsel have been a credit to the Senate throughout the pandemic. Here in the chamber, I want to thank our cloakroom teams led by Gary Myrick on the Democratic side and Robert Duncan on ours. Duncan had only just stepped into his current role when the crisis began to unfold. He navigated about 10 years' worth of big challenges in his first 10 months in the top job. Thanks to him and his capable deputy, Chris Tuck. Another key group these past months have been our Rules Committee led by Chairman Blunt and his staff director, Fitzhugh Elder. The committee has run point on coordinating many of the changes and adaptations that have helped keep this body safe. They've done an outstanding job without enough recognition or thanks. We're grateful to the men and women of the Capitol Police, led by Chief Stephen Sund, who have stood their post even when most of the rest of us have worked remotely. They've stood strong during this pandemic, during protests, both peaceful and otherwise, and during the other daily operations that they handle with courage and professionalism. And across the board, I want to thank all of our Senate staff, both the smaller footprint who have continued physically working at the Capitol and those who kept up their hard work remotely have confronted all kinds of novel challenges. Our institution and our country are grateful to you all. Last but not least, I want to thank my own team. My personal office, led by departing Chief of Staff Bill Maxson, has fought every day for Kentuckians' needs and priorities throughout this crisis. Our state offices, steered by Terry Carmack, kept us connected to our constituents in new ways. My communications director, Robert Stewart, and all their colleagues who staff these operations are invaluable to me and to Kentucky. Here in the Capitol, my leadership staff has given incredible amounts of themselves to me, to our team, and to the Senate the entire year. Remember, this is somehow still the same calendar year that began with an impeachment trial, continued through the CARES Act, other major legislation over the summer, a Supreme Court vacancy and confirmation this fall, and finally the all-out legislative sprint since Thanksgiving. First, my two deputy chiefs of staff. Steph Muckall runs our operations in an incredibly, historically complex time to handle operations. She's worn about 10 different hats all year long, as usual. And Scott Rabb handles policy. He's led his colleagues through a legislative year like no other, from mammoth negotiations and historic rescue packages to our most particular priorities and everything in between. We've all leaned on Scott heavily, and he's been indispensable. Beneath them, within our operation, are a lot of talented folks I'm lucky to have. I want to name them very briefly. My chief counsel, Andrew Ferguson, offers brilliant advice from impeachment to policy to the judiciary. Robert Karam, my defense policy expert, has brought critical institutional leadership as 2020 tested everything from national security to continuity of government. Jane Lee handles her massive portfolio and more besides, with incredible effectiveness and calm under fire, and she sings the best Christmas carols in the office. Terry Van Doren is a policy master who delivers for Kentucky and the country every time. Erica Suarez and Jim Neal, expert liaisons and advisors who keep me connected inside the Senate and beyond. Steve Donaldson, my point man on all things election law during this election year. John Chappies, a seasoned Senate veteran who picked quite the time to join our team and cover economic policy. Jody Wright fights to get good people in good positions with good cheer. Andy Quinn is a master of words and ideas. David Popp heads my press team. He, Doug Andres, Scott Sloofman, and their whole operation keep my message and the Republican conference's message front and center. Sarah Steinberg manages my days, and Alex Jenkins manages my office, both with great humor and greater professionalism. Moon Selfab keeps our technology systems running and our spirits high. I have to mention our healthcare expert, Jen Koskowski, who worked remotely this spring while expecting her baby boy and has been cheering us on while on maternity leave. We can't wait to get her back. And thanks to Grace Graham and Peter Oppenheim, who Senator Alexander generously shared from his Help Committee staff to help us in Jen's absence. Rounding out our leadership team are crack researchers Robert Utze and David Hauptman, skilled communicators Dylan Vorbeck, Valerie Chicola, Suzanne Youngblood, Emily Houck, and Catherine Grayson. And our frontline troops, the jack of all trades who keep everybody in line, Victoria Mason, Elise Stebick, and Spencer Abraham. Finally, Mr. President, at the head of this entire team is our fearless leader, our Chief of Staff, Sharon Soderstrom. Everybody on Capitol Hill and everybody in Washington knows that Sharon is one of the smartest, most dedicated, and most effective staff leaders working at any level in any branch of government. She's my first call and my last call on every subject. She was in the leader's office before I was. She supported both Trent Lott and Bill Frist. So I count my blessings on a daily basis that I am lucky, number 3. Sharon carries the weight of the world on her shoulders and not only delivers, but somehow prioritizes lightening everybody else's load while she's at it. A walking master class in leadership. I'm proud of all that we've accomplished for the country in this challenging year, and I couldn't be gladder to be heading into 2021 with these talented professionals at my side. So I thank them, Mr. President. I thank them one and all.
On the nomination, is there sufficient second? There appears to be. And the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gardner. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Ms. Harris. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Jones. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mrs. Loeffler. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Paul. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Collins, Cornyn, Kramer, Gardner, Graham, Hyde-Smith, Inhofe, McConnell, Risch, Wicker. Senators voting in the negative: Bennett, Casey, Duckworth, Durbin, Hassan, Heinrich, Jones, Kelly, Schatz, Smith, Stabenow, Udall. Mr. Kane, no. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Booker, no. Mr. Brown, no. Mr. Manchin, no. Mr. Carper, no. Mr. Daines, aye. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Blunt, aye. Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mr. Peters, Mr. Peters, no. Mr. Leahy, Mr. Leahy, no. Mr. Grassley, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Reed, no, no. Mr. Rubio, aye. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Hoven, aye. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. King, no. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Cotton, aye. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Markey, no. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Tillis, aye. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Scott, Florida, aye. Mr. Merkley, no. Ms. Rosen, no. Mr. Langford, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Moran, aye. Later. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mrs. Murray, aye. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Sass, aye. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mrs. Feinstein, no. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Tester, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Romney, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. I think I do.
Also, then it's an amendment for both of them.
Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. Braun, aye. Mr. Menendez, no. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Ms. Ernst, aye. Mr. Cardin, no. Mr. Sanders, no. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Alexander, aye. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Schumer, no. Ms. Sinema, Ms. Sinema. No.
Mr. Sullivan, aye.
Mr. Cruz, aye.
On this vote, the yeas are 48, the nays 47. The nomination is confirmed.
Mr. President. Mr. President,
The Majority Leader.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to legislative session and be in a period of morning business. The senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Is there objection?
I ask
Without
the chair to
objection.
lay before the Senate the message to accompany H.R. 133.
The Chair lays before the Senate the following message from the House.
Resolved that the House agree to the amendment of the Senate to the bill H.R. 133 entitled An Act to Promote Economic Partnership and Cooperation between the United States and Mexico with an amendment to the Senate amendment.
I move to concur in the House amendment to the Senate amendment to H.R. 133.
The motion is pending.
I ask unanimous consent there be 60 minutes of debate equally divided between the leaders or their designees, and that following the use or yielding back of that time, the Senate vote on the motion to concur without further motions or amendments in order, and that 60 affirmative votes be required to adopt the motion to concur.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Mr. President.
The Senator from North Dakota.
Mr. President, North Dakota is an energy powerhouse, and our lignite producers work around the clock to ensure homes and businesses in the Midwest have affordable and reliable access to power when it's needed most. But the PTC, the wind production tax credit, is creating artificially low prices in markets for power generation. Qualified wind projects are receiving up to 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour from the taxpayer. These subsidies distort the market and are forcing out the critical coal-fired baseload generation we need to keep the lights on. Since Congress established a wind production tax credit in 1992, wind power has been able to transition from an emerging technology to a multi-billion-dollar industry that is clearly commercially viable. That's why we worked on a bipartisan agreement in 2015 to phase down and sunset the wind tax credit at the end of 2019. We had an agreement to do the phase out, and the wind industry agreed to it. I worked with Senator Thune and AWEA, the American Wind Energy Association, and others to do it. And they agreed. We had an agreement. That's why we are opposed to extending the PTC and offer an amendment to strike it. We saw what happened in California over the summer, and we can't afford to have blackouts and brownouts during the coldest of winter weather months. We instead must strengthen grid resiliency and reliability by keeping diverse sources of generation available at all times, including when the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining. That means baseload. Instead of extending the production tax credit, we should be working on making technologies like carbon capture and sequestration commercially viable. The American Wind Energy Association states on its website that, quote, growth in the wind industry is expected to remain strong when the PTC is fully phased out. Why then are we considering another extension of this credit when the leading trade association expects to see strong growth for the wind industry without the credit? We need to bring back a level playing field for competition in our electricity markets and reverse the trend of taxpayers continuing to subsidize a mature, multi-billion-dollar wind industry. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment and ensure that the wind production tax credit sunsets. And with that, I'd like to ask for some words from my co-sponsor on the amendment, Senator Kramer.
Mr. President.
Senator from North Dakota.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to join my colleague, Senator Hoeven, in offering this amendment and urging our colleagues to support the amendment to strip the wind production tax credit from this massive bill. Mr. President, I feel like I'm living in an episode of The Twilight Zone, and I wish I could say that I'm surprised, but I'm not. Because here we go again. Despite numerous requests and appeals and deals with the leader and the chairman of the Finance Committee to not jam this body with a 13th extension of the wind production tax credit, here we are with another one in front of us. Since the credit's inception in 1992, and for a lot of those years I was a utility regulator, it has always been promised that it would be temporary and would expire. Last year we got jammed at the last minute with another extension. And rightly, the people back home are really, really upset with us. And it didn't sit very well with me either. That's why in April of this year, I led a letter to Leader McConnell with colleagues from West Virginia, Wyoming, and Georgia, saying it was time to finally level the playing field and get rid of this market-distorting atrocity. In July, I led another letter to Chairman Grassley with even more colleagues from West Virginia, Wyoming, Tennessee, Oklahoma, and Pennsylvania with the same message: let this credit expire. Yet here we are again. The requests have fallen on deaf ears, and we've simply been given another bitter pill to swallow with the extension today. Some in this town have pointed to an extension in carbon sequestration credits like 45Q and 48A as if they were an equal trade. They're not. Despite years of pleading, the Treasury Department, yes, this Treasury Department, still has not finalized regulations. So an extension of 45Q is moot if there's no way to actually monetize the credit. Of equal importance, financial investors have said if renewable credits are extended, they will absorb whatever tax appetite exists because they're predictable. And those deals have been done many times. And just to reiterate, they can't even utilize 45Q because Treasury hasn't finished the regulations 3 years after Congress expanded the credit. More to the point, while there are some great proposed carbon sequestration projects planned in North Dakota, their benefit is targeted, while in contrast, hundreds of miners and local communities they built are being hurt by the extension of the production tax credit. I strongly support carbon sequester projects, but to assume that the potential benefits of 45Q or 48A are equal to the unilateral harm of the wind credit is disingenuous at best. And I've heard from utilities who actually use the wind PTC, but they said they don't need it because the market is so awash with wind credits they can't even monetize them. It's completely upside down. In fact, the PTC credits are actually taking money away from other clean energy projects like nuclear, clean coal, taking emissions-free energy right off the grid. Just a few days ago, Politico said this: the simplest option for tax extenders would be to let all 33 that are scheduled to expire at the end of the year to be renewed. I have a simpler plan. Let them all expire. K Street wouldn't like it, but it'd be one less section in this giant package. So, Mr. President, one final point. In all my time in Congress, and that's been 8 years now, the wind production tax credit has never been extended through regular order or an open discussion or even hearings. Despite our objections or promises from the wind industry that it should expire, in the 11th hour with the government shutdown looming, it gets dropped into the members' laps. That alone should be a red flag that the only time it has enough chance to pass is when it rides the coattails of our national defense and the government operations. It's shameful, Mr. President, and I support the amendment from Senator Hoeven, and I urge my colleagues to support it as well. Let the wind PTC expire. I yield my time.
Mr. President, I thank my colleague, Senator Kramer, and turn to my colleague, Senator Langford.
Mr. President,
The senator from Oklahoma.
I'll be brief. My staff did what many of us did today. We spent the day digging through a 5,600-page bill, trying to find out what's in it. We broke it up into hundreds of pages of chunks and separated among our staff and just started reading through it as quickly as we could, trying to be able to pull out the details. We found a lot of things that we really like. We found a few surprises as well. So help us, we found right in the middle of the document on tax policy a zombie, the wind production tax credit, something that we had heard had died. In fact, something that we had heard died 2 years ago. In fact, something that we had heard died 6 years ago when all of us agreed it should die. In fact, the plan was take it down a little bit each and every year until it finally got to zero. The problem was when it got to zero, some lobbyists helped somebody get it back in last year, and it suddenly, after going to zero, reappeared. And then, so help me, it reappeared again. So this temporary credit that distorts the market, that literally changes the prices and all of our energy, whether that be oil or gas or coal or solar or hydroelectric or nuclear. It gives a special perk to one, and all of the rest of them get furious, but for whatever reason, this simple credit can't seem to go away. When we agree to something, we should probably stick to it. And we agreed years ago to phase this out. But yet this zombie keeps reappearing and walking the halls of the Senate. Our simple challenge is this. Let's put this zombie in the daylight. Let's have the real argument over it and determine, is this distorting the energy market for everybody else, including all of our renewables? Is it something we need to keep? Now, I live in Oklahoma, and if you know our song, you know the wind comes sweeping down the plains. We have been called the Saudi Arabia of wind power. I promise you can't drive very far in Oklahoma without seeing a field of windmills. We've got lots of wind power, and we think it's a great energy source. But it's a mature energy source, and it does not need the wind production tax credit. So let's sunset it. With that, I yield.
Mr. President, I'd like to thank my colleague, Senator Langford. Also, we'd like to thank Senator Lamar Alexander, Senator Barrasso, others that support this legislation. And with that, I ask unanimous consent that our motion to concur with the amendment, which is at the desk, be agreed to, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to object, Mr. President.
The senator from Oregon.
Mr. President and colleagues, I am going to be brief. And I just want to give the Senate a sense of where we are with respect to this renewable energy issue. In front of us now is a bipartisan agreement to extend a variety of approaches that are going to allow us to promote greener energy that reduces carbon emissions. And when I talk to colleagues on both sides of the aisle, there's enormous support for that, enormous support for the effort to reduce carbon emissions. Now, I can look around this chamber, and I can see colleagues starting over in that corner with Senator Heinrich, who has worked for years on renewable energy, and literally go around the chamber and point out colleagues who have worked with me and others on the renewable energy provisions that are part of this bipartisan agreement. This includes not just the credits for wind, but solar and renewable energy. And I would submit this is the best approach to what we have today, which is a need to make sure that critical investments are not missed out on now. Now, for the future, we do have a plan, and that is to have a technology-neutral approach that would avoid picking winners and losers and basically taking this mess of a tax code with more than 40 separate energy provisions, throwing it in the trash, and saying we're going to focus on one thing, reducing carbon emissions. We aren't there today. That's what this issue is all about. But what is here today is climate change. And that is why it is so important that we pass the legislation that is in the bill and reject this amendment. So with that, I want to say to my colleagues from North Dakota, I remember enjoying going to North Dakota for the sponsor of this amendment. I will tell you, if you're over 6 feet tall, make sure you exercise before you go to North Dakota, because you will be in the smallest airline seat in the history of aviation. But John Hoeven is a very good and caring man. I'm looking forward to working with him on these issues in the future. And, Mr. President, with that, I would object.
Mr. President.
Objection is heard.
Mr.
The
President.
senator from North Dakota.
I would ask my colleague from Oregon, and I did have him in North Dakota. We had a great time, and I appreciate him coming out to see the energy we produce in our great state. And I would ask the gentleman for his help on carbon capture technologies. We've put funding in place to advance those carbon capture technologies, and I ask for his help and his colleagues' help in that endeavor.
I would just say to my colleague, I'm always interested in working with him for the future. I would just say that the focus after we pass this bill, and particularly these important provisions which are going to meet immediate needs, let's just set as our lodestar reducing carbon emissions. You and I served on the Energy Committee together. That's an approach that brings together Republicans and Democrats. And with that, Mr. President, I yield.
Mr. President,
Senator from North
I thank
Dakota.
my co-sponsors on this amendment, and our efforts will continue. With that, I yield the floor.
I'd note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
would have order in the Senate? Mr. President,
Senators will please take their conversations off the floor. The Majority Leader.
I ask consent that further proceedings on the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
I ask the chair to lay before the Senate the message to accompany H.R. 1520.
The chair lays before the Senate the following message from the House.
Resolved that the House agree to the amendment of the Senate to the bill H.R. 1520 entitled An Act to Amend the Public Health Service Act to provide for the publication of a list of licensed biological products and for other purposes with an amendment to the Senate amendment.